This is the Anti-Terrorism Bill of 2020, a piece of legislation that was designed as a stricter and harsher version of its older counterpart, the Human Security Act. But it was met with so much backlash because it's perceived to potentially violate democratic rights to free speech and privacy. The pace at which it was passed also seemed to have been railroaded by the legislative branch, and the fact that a great part of the process happened against a backdrop of a global pandemic also worsened its reception. But the criticism is not a simple public perception problem. The scope and its sheer definition of terrorism are also highly questionable, because despite its name, the Anti-Terrorism Bill of 2020 appears to not actively target armed terrorists, but to intensify the Duterte administration's crackdown on journalists, critics, and activists, heightening the fear that the country is approaching a dark age for democracy. To understand the Anti-Terrorism Bill of 2020, we have to go back to 2007, when President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo signed the Human Security Act, a law that aims to improve the government's resistance against terrorist groups. At this time, the events of Rizal Day bombing in 2000, the 9/11 attacks in 2001, and the Super Ferry 14 tragedy of 2004 were still fresh in the collective memory of the country. But even if it seems like the Human Security Act was timely, it was widely criticized for its vague and overbroad definition of what terrorism is. It also had the potential to be used against journalists and activists at that time. So the 18th Congress decided to design something stricter and harsher in punishment. That is the Anti-Terrorism Bill of 2020. The only problem is, it didn't address the main criticisms on Human Security Act. In fact, the Anti-Terrorism Bill has an even broader and vaguer definition of what terrorism is, opening it to misinterpretation and abuse. Engaging in activities that inflict physical injury to someone, spreading a message of fear by causing an explosion or fire, or damaging a critical infrastructure like government offices or public spaces. Even carrying or buying weapons count as terrorist activities. So, burning an effigy, for example, which is a powerful statement done in rallies, may fall under causing fire and spreading fear to the public. And then there's this, inciting to terrorism. It's a new violation that the Anti-Terrorism Act includes. Speeches, proclamations, writings, emblems, banners, or other representations can be considered as acts of instigating terrorism. This sparked so much backlash, because this means that even if you're just at home, tweeting or sharing posts online, or distributing an image that contains critical views of the government, you can be tagged as a suspect and get arrested if law enforcers decide that you are involved in a bigger terrorist activity. And who exactly decides if someone is a suspect? Well, there are two ways. But first, we have to look at how the government is structured. There's the legislative branch, which includes the Congress and the Senate. They draft and pass bills. There's the judicial branch, which is composed of the Supreme Court and lower courts. And then there's the executive branch. You have the president and the vice president, together with the cabinet and executive departments. The first way to decide whether someone is a suspect is through the judicial branch. The Department of Justice files a case, and the Court of Appeals will look into it and give their decision. The second way is through the executive branch, and this is where it gets tricky. In order for this design to work, there has to be an equilibrium. Branches should be able to call each other out through check and balance. So when we put too much power in just one branch, the balance is lost, and what you have is an unreliable system that is prone to abuse of power and bias. But the Anti-Terrorism Act will recreate an Anti-Terrorism Council composed mostly of cabinet members and the Anti-Money Laundering Council executive director, and all of them were appointed by the president himself. This council can designate and identify suspected terrorists and begin surveillance, investigations, and arrests. This caused tension especially to young people who actively criticize the government, whether in public or online.
what we see in the terror bill is a way for the state or the government to crack down on its dissenters or its critics. But on a larger scale, it is a preemptive measures of the state to at least pacify the anger of its constituents, especially during this pandemic. They, instead of answering to the clamor of the people, to mass testing, to stricter labor policies to protect the workers' rights, and also to forward human rights concerns during the lockdown, they prioritize the passage of this bill. The anti-terror bill is not just a fight of the activists or the dissenters of the vote or the opposition, but the anti-terror bill is also the fight of common people. If you curtail the freedom of the individuals to freedom of their speech, actually they will be furious. So imagine if the people or the Filipino people realized how deadly the anti-terrorism bill is. I don't trust the government actually in terms of how will they define terrorism, but I do trust that the Filipino people will have an enlightenment phase where they will realize that this bill will kill more lives compared to Tokha.
The Anti-Terrorism Bill also allows for state surveillance. Under Section 16, it is perfectly legal for law enforcers to wiretap, read, record, and collect any form of communications like private data and messages for 60 to 90 days. They can look at chat groups, online posts, and text messages, listen to phone calls and voice notes, and compile them as evidence to prove involvement in a terrorist activity, and all of these can be done without your permission. In principle, creating an anti-terrorism law is not wrong. It can actually help us feel more secure. But the thing is, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 lacks the concrete assurance that freedoms of speech, assembly, privacy, and basic human rights will be upheld. What's more worrying is that the Duterte administration has multiple records of violations. There have been alleged fabrication of cases against critics, red tagging and killing of activists and community leaders, arrests of journalists, and thousands of extrajudicial killings. If the anti-terrorism bill is passed, Filipinos are worried that the unlawful treatment to political opposition can extend even to regular citizens and lead to thousands of arrests, imprisonments, and torture, targeting not just activists and journalists, but even Filipinos who are simply expressing discontent towards the government. But criticism, protests, activism, joining organizations, being in a community, these are not crimes. They shouldn't be. They're part of our freedoms in this country, ensured by the Constitution itself. If the anti-terrorism bill is passed as a law, people are afraid that we will go back to dark times, that our freedom will be repressed, that our rights will be stolen and violated, and that our demand for progress will be taken against us. But if there's any assurance, it's that woven in our history are powerful stories of fights against oppression and its perpetrators, and that when forces push to steal our freedom and peace, we resist.